Histobiograph.
Imagine a king so swollen with disease that his own body began to rot while he was still alive. His legs ulcerated, blackened with gangrene. His breath reeked of infection. His courtiers, bound by duty, stood nearby in silence, faces hidden behind perfumed cloths, as the stench of their monarch's decay filled the room. When he finally died, the horror didn't end. His bloated corpse leaked fluids that seeped through the coffin. In the chapel of Sion Abbey, stray dogs lapped at the remains of a king once worshipped as God's shadow on earth. This isn't a scene from a horror film. It's not a myth. It's history. And it is the story of Henry VIII, the mighty Lion of England, who in death became a grotesque lesson in mortality. We know Henry as the king of 6 wives, of broken churches, of severed heads. But few speak of his end. Few dare. Because his death wasn't dignified. It was repugnant, humiliating, and deeply symbolic. What happens when absolute power meets absolute decay? What does it say about kings, when even kings are eaten by dogs? Before he became a monster, Henry was a marvel. He was born on June 28, 1491, into the powerful but precarious house of Tudor. His father, Henry VII, had seized the English crown through blood and calculation. His mother, Elizabeth of York, linked him to the fallen Plantagenets. Henry was their second son. The throne was never meant for him. That honor belonged to his older brother, Arthur, a boy named after a mythical king, destined to restore the glory of Britain. But fate had other plans. At the age of 15, Arthur died suddenly after falling ill just months into his marriage with the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon. All eyes turned to the spare. At just 10 years old, Henry Tudor became heir to the throne. By 17, he was king. Unlike his father, cautious, cold, tight-fisted, Henry VIII burst into power like a blazing comet. He was tall, athletic, and strikingly handsome. He loved hunting, jousting, dancing, and music. He composed songs. He spoke fluent Latin and French. He debated theology with clerics twice his age. He wrote treatises against Martin Luther. To foreign ambassadors, he seemed a golden prince. One even called him the most accomplished sovereign in Christendom. To the English nobility, long weary of his father's penny-pinching tyranny, he was a refreshing breeze of youth, confidence, and charm. Henry wasn't just admired. He was adored. His coronation in 1509 was a spectacle of triumph. Crowds lined the streets of London to catch a glimpse of the radiant young monarch and his new bride, Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his brother. Their marriage united dynasties, strengthened England's alliance with Spain, and seemed to signal a new golden age. For a while, it did. Henry revitalized court life. He revived tournaments, encouraged humanist scholars, and poured money into majestic palaces and pageantry. He saw himself as a warrior king in the mold of ancient heroes Alexander, Caesar, Arthur. He dreamt not only of ruling England but of being remembered forever. Yet beneath the golden veneer, cracks had already begun to form. Despite his charisma, Henry was impatient, deeply insecure, and obsessed with legacy. He longed for conquest but feared the instability of a short-lived dynasty. Above all, he wanted a son, not for love, for power, for permanence, for immortality. And that desire planted in his youth would one day grow monstrous. But in those early years, the mask held firm. Portraits painted during this time show a man of divine proportion, broad-chested, vibrant-eyed, draped in velvet and jewels, the very embodiment of Renaissance majesty. But portraits lie. They do not show the shadow he cast over his advisors. They do not reveal the temper tantrums. They do not hint at the narcissism slowly fermenting beneath the surface. Even as he jousted before cheering crowds and played lute by candlelight, Henry watched his wife's womb and the empty cradle beside their marriage bed. He celebrated each pregnancy, only to mourn miscarriage after miscarriage. Only one child, a daughter, Mary, survived. And a daughter was not enough. The whispers began. Was it Catherine's fault? Was God punishing him for marrying his brother's widow? Or was it a test? Henry didn't know, but he believed fiercely that he was destined for greatness. And if that greatness required breaking with tradition, with Rome, with heaven itself, then so be it. In the years to come, the vibrant prince would become something else entirely. But for now, England's young king danced in the light. And no one, not even Henry, could yet see the darkness gathering at the edges of his reign. For kings, having a son is not just personal. It's political. It's spiritual. It's survival. A male heir secures the bloodline. A male heir prevents civil war. A male heir is the proof that the king is favored by God. Henry VIII knew this, and he needed, a son with every fiber of his being. At first, he waited with hope. Catherine of Aragon bore child after child. But one by one, they were lost, miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who died within weeks. Only Mary survived. It wasn't enough. To the court, he began to show signs of strain. Behind the music and the tournaments, his confidence started to chip. He consulted astrologers, herbalists, even relics of saints said to cure infertility. He prayed at shrines. He fasted. He gave alms. But God remained silent. So Henry made a decision, one that would send shockwaves through Christendom. He would cast Catherine aside. But this wasn't easy. Divorce wasn't permitted in the eyes of the church, especially not for a king whose wife had once been married to his brother. That made things complicated. So Henry invented a solution. My marriage was never valid, he declared. It was cursed from the beginning. He turned to the Pope, demanding an annulment. But the Pope refused, not just out of theology, but out of politics. Catherine's nephew was none other than Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Offending Catherine meant offending half of Europe. So Henry broke the game. He tore England away from the Catholic Church, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and seized the power to nullify his own marriage. It was unprecedented, heretical, dangerous. But it was done. And in her place came Anne Boleyn, dark-haired, sharp-witted, and politically savvy, and was unlike any woman Henry had known. She had refused to be his mistress, insisted on marriage, and intoxicated the king with her defiance. She was his most dear, his queen of hearts, his promised mother of sons. And for a time, Henry was reborn, and was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony, and soon she became pregnant. The kingdom buzzed with excitement. This would be it, the long-awaited prince. But in 1533, the child was born. A girl. She was named Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed, but not defeated, and became pregnant again and again, but each pregnancy ended in failure. Meanwhile, the court began to whisper dangerously, and had enemies. Powerful ones. Traditionalists who had never accepted Henry's break from Rome. Courtiers loyal to Catherine. Ambitious men who feared Anne's growing influence. And soon, Henry, once besotted, grew cold. By 1536, just 3 years after her coronation, Anne Boleyn was arrested. She was charged with adultery, incest, treason. The trials were swift. The evidence was dubious. The outcome was certain. On a spring morning, Anne was led to the scaffold. She wore gray. Her lips trembled. Before the executioner's sword fell, she whispered a prayer, and then she was gone. Henry had murdered the woman he'd changed the world for. But there was no time for mourning. Within days, he married Jane Seymour. Plain, quiet, obedient, Jane was everything and had not been. And in 1537, she did what Catherine and Anne could not. She gave birth to a son, Edward. Henry wept with joy. For a moment, he had it all, a male heir, a legacy secured, a kingdom at peace. But joy, in Henry's world, never lasted long. Jane Seymour died from postnatal complications just days after Edward's birth. She was the only wife Henry would later call his true love. He buried her beside him. Edward was crowned Prince of Wales. He would be the future. And yet, deep down, Henry knew the price had been high. 2 wives gone. A kingdom divided from Rome. Thousands executed in the name of religious reform. Monasteries looted. Church bells silenced. Friends turned enemies. And still, he was not satisfied. Because Henry didn't just want a son. He wanted control. He wanted adoration. He wanted to be remembered as a god among kings. And history would not cooperate. It was supposed to be a celebration. A tournament at Greenwich Palace. January 1536. The court had gathered in finery. Music filled the halls. Henry, then 44, still fancied himself the gallant knight, strong, virile, untouchable. He charged into the lists on horseback, armor gleaming, the crowd roaring. And then, the horse fell. The king didn't rise. He lay motionless for 2 hours. Unconscious. Silent. Lifeless. Some thought he had died. And in a way, he had. When Henry finally stirred, something was different. Something irreversible. His body had been broken, but so had his mind. The leg was badly crushed. Deep tissue damage. Blood clots. The wound refused to heal. Over the coming weeks, it worsened, festering, blistering, ulcerating. It became a permanent, oozing sore, and no doctor could fix it. He could no longer walk without agony. The leg became grotesquely swollen. It emitted a stench so foul that even seasoned knights gagged in his presence. And yet no one dared speak of it. To offend the king's pride was to risk the scaffold. So courtiers trained themselves to smile through nausea. Servants carried trays of scented cloths to hold over their noses. The palace windows were thrown open in the dead of winter. Still, the rot lingered. And Henry changed. He grew paranoid, suspicious, short-tempered. The jovial prince was gone. In his place stood a man increasingly ruled by pain and bitterness. Some historians believe the fall damaged more than his leg. Perhaps a concussion. Perhaps neurological trauma. Whatever the cause, the effect was undeniable. He began to strike out without warning, turning on once trusted advisors. He accused allies of treason. He snapped at his own children. He lashed out at Catherine of Aragon's supporters, accelerating their downfall. Worse still, his body began to betray him further. In the following months, he ballooned in size. He could no longer ride, could barely walk. His weight surged past 300 pounds. The king who once jousted for glory now needed mechanical pulleys to lift himself out of bed. Doorways were widened to accommodate his frame. Special thrones were built to support his girth. His personal armor, once sleek and golden, now looked like an oversized iron cauldron. But the pain never stopped. Every step was torment. The ulcer on his leg grew deeper, oozing pus, eventually exposing raw bone. Physicians, limited by primitive medicine, tried every desperate measure. Fire-hot irons to cauterize the wound. Skull and crossbones mercury and arsenic to purge infection. Syringe endless bloodletting. Nothing worked. The stench of death and life followed him everywhere. Attendants passed out. Nobles vomited discreetly. Yet all kept silent. To be honest was to be executed. And as his physical suffering deepened, so too did his moral descent. He ordered executions with greater frequency. He crushed rebellions with merciless force. He spied on his court. He had friends tortured. He beheaded noblemen on suspicion alone. Even whispers were dangerous. This was no longer a man defending power. It was a man terrified of losing it. What is certain is this. The man who emerged after the jousting accident was not the man who had taken the throne decades earlier. He had become something else. A creature of wounded pride, of rage, of rot. And England would suffer under his transformation. They once called him the perfect Renaissance man. Now, the king's own body had turned against him. Henry VIII's decline wasn't sudden. It was slow, humiliating, and visible to all who dared look. But no one could speak of it. Not out loud. To do so was treason. By the early 1540s, Henry's body had become a walking tomb. His waistline had ballooned to over 54 inches. His once powerful legs were useless and ulcerated. His weight, nearly 400 pounds, rendered movement almost impossible. He no longer strode through his palaces like a lion. He was dragged, rolled, hoisted. A complex pulley system was designed just to lift him from bed to chair. His personal staff expanded, not for courtly affairs, but to manage the sheer logistics of his bulk. His diet remained a grotesque parody of royalty. Roast boars, spiced pies, flagons of ale, lamb, venison, suckling pig, goose, duck, served in one meal. All paired with zero vegetables. Those, after all, were for peasants. Over 5,000 calories a day, every day, pushed his organs to collapse. His physicians, limited by medieval understanding, only worsened his condition. They bled him regularly, applied leeches, smothered his ulcers in herbs, horse fat, and powdered gold. But the infection deepened. His leg, once wounded, now reeked of gangrene, a stench so overpowering that guards fainted. Visitors grew pale. The ulcer festered until it revealed exposed bone, oozing a mixture of blood, pus, and decay. And still, the mask had to remain. Rooms were sprayed with perfume. Tapestries were hung to trap the smell. Courtiers bowed with perfumed cloths held discreetly near their faces. The illusion of majesty had to be maintained, even as the king rotted from the inside out. His mobility vanished. He no longer hunted. He no longer danced. He no longer played music. Even the act of sitting caused pain. But worse than the immobility was the impotence. For a man who equated virility with divine right, the betrayal of his own flesh was unbearable. He lashed out more frequently. Executions became routine. Entire households were wiped out with a signature. His court lived in terror. Love, too, became impossible. Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, was just 19. Henry, by then in his 50s, bloated and ulcered, tried to recreate passion. But she found him repulsive. He reeked. His sores leaked. She avoided his bed. She sought comfort elsewhere. And like and before her, she paid the price. Adultery, treason, execution. Henry watched her die with stone-cold silence. He blamed her, never himself. By now, no portrait could save the illusion. Official paintings still depicted him as regal, upright, golden, stern-faced. But behind closed doors, the truth was grotesque. The once heroic silhouette had turned monstrous. His hands trembled. His eyes were bloodshot. His face was bloated and pallid. His breath reeked of rot. His stools were black and tarry. His nights were filled with moaning and fever dreams. Servants reported screams echoing through the palace. He slept little. He raged often. And worst of all, he feared. Not rebellion. Not invasion. He feared being forgotten. Henry had ruled for over 3 decades. But what would remain? A broken church? A line of dead wives? A sickly son? He began to obsess over legacy. Commissioned tapestries. Ordered new portraits. Built vast tombs for himself. But none of it hid the truth. The Lion of England was rotting alive. His throne was now a wheelchair. His robes, specially tailored to conceal swelling limbs. His crown a heavy, but hollow. He ordered mirrors removed from chambers. He refused to let doctors speak frankly. Any suggestion that he was unwell was treated as sedition. In his mind, he was still mighty. But the walls whispered otherwise. Behind velvet curtains, courtiers gossiped in terror. Some said the king was cursed. Others swore they had seen maggots in his dressings. The smell reached neighboring halls. In the cold, damp silence of his chambers, Henry stared at ceilings and imagined eternity. But all he could feel was the rot climbing higher. Pain changes a man. It doesn't just break the body. It warps the soul. For Henry VIII, the pain never ended. It festered with every step, with every heartbeat, with every breath. And over time, it transformed him into something darker. He had always possessed a temper. But now it flared violently, unpredictably, and without warning. One moment he'd smile. The next, he'd explode. Servants cowered. Courtiers vanished. His own children tread carefully in his presence. He no longer trusted anyone. Not his advisors. Not his wives. Not even his own flesh and blood. The pain whispered lies in his ear. They're conspiring. They want your crown. They want your son. Henry began to surround himself with flatterers. Yes men. Cowards. Men who told him what he wanted to hear, not what he needed to know. And those who didn't? They vanished. Some were imprisoned. Others tortured. Many were simply beheaded and forgotten. Henry had the Tower of London filled with ghosts, political rivals, former friends, even those who once nursed him through fever. He had become a tyrant, but not out of pure malice. Out of fear. The more his body decayed, the more his grip on power tightened. He ruled not through vision, but through terror. He read reports of rebellion with trembling hands. He ordered mass executions across the north. He burned heretics, hanged dissenters, publicly displayed dismembered bodies on London Bridge. To rule was not enough. He had to dominate. He had to be feared, revered, obeyed without question. But deep down, he knew what fear really was, because he lived with it. Fear that his son would die. Fear that his name would be erased. Fear that his soul was already condemned. Henry had long styled himself a defender of the faith. He had written against Martin Luther, broken with Rome, appointed himself head of the Church of England. But even divine titles could not mask damnation. At night, he lay awake, sweating, groaning, haunted. Not by war, not by enemies, but by wives. By Catherine, the faithful queen he discarded. By Anne, whose eyes he saw in their daughter Elizabeth. By Jane, who died bringing him his only son. By Catherine Howard, beheaded for betrayal. By Catherine Parr, his last wife, more nurse than lover, who watched in silence as he unraveled. Their faces blurred in his fever dreams. He began to lash out with legislation. New laws were passed declaring it treason to predict the king's death. Even whispering about his illness was punishable by death. The court walked on shards of glass. Even Thomas More, once a friend, had not been spared. When More refused to accept Henry's self-declared supremacy over the church, he was jailed, tried, and executed. His head was displayed on a pike. Henry didn't flinch. Because now, mercy was weakness. Compassion was danger. That was death. And still, it was not enough to quiet the noise. Behind every gift was suspicion. Behind every smile, a knife. His mind turned labyrinthine. He tested loyalty with impossible commands. He staged false accusations to see who would fold. He flipped allies against one another for amusement. He had become the center of a palace of shadows, where no one knew who might fall next. Even his own daughters were not safe. He declared Mary illegitimate, then Elizabeth. Then, when he needed alliances, he restored them, only to revoke again. They were pawns, not children. Edward, the sickly, pale boy he had prayed for, was locked away behind guarded doors. The boy was rarely seen, rarely touched, rarely smiled. Henry didn't want a son. He wanted an heir, an extension of himself. But the mirror showed otherwise. His body was failing. His name had become a curse. His kingdom was cracking beneath the weight of religious chaos. And no one, not even God, seemed willing to stop what was coming. He had once been the Golden Prince. Now, he was the Mad King in the iron chair, whose groans echoed through palace walls, whose rage was law, whose ulcers stained silk sheets, and whose soul had begun to rot alongside his leg. He was not feared because he was strong. He was feared because he had nothing left to lose. He still sought comfort. Later that same year, he married Catherine Parr, a mature and intelligent widow. Unlike her predecessors, she didn't charm Henry with beauty or flirtation. She offered something else, peace. And above all, care. Catherine Parr became less of a queen and more of a nurse. She managed his medications, monitored his diet, organized his chambers. She ensured his ulcers were dressed, his mood soothed, his religious anxieties calmed. She knew how to keep him alive, if only for a while. But even Catherine walked a dangerous line. She was Protestant, well-read, and opinionated. Too opinionated. When she dared to debate theology with Henry, he took offense. A warrant for her arrest was drafted. She was to be interrogated, perhaps worse. But Catherine, astute and swift, threw herself at his feet. She claimed she had only spoken to distract him from his pain. Henry accepted the flattery. The warrant was torn up. But the message was clear. Even the nurse must tread lightly in the house of a dying god. As Henry slipped further into illness, his court transformed into a tense web of factions and spies. Nobles aligned themselves with the boy Prince Edward. Others bet on Mary or Elizabeth. Some waited for Henry to die before choosing sides. And yet, the king endured. Through pus, through screams, through endless fevers, he survived. By 1546, he had become almost inhuman. He no longer walked. He was carried everywhere, his massive frame hidden behind thick curtains. His meals were brought on silver trays, untouched by common hands. His communications were filtered through pages and physicians. He was a king wrapped in isolation. No longer a ruler. A relic. A breathing corpse of a man who once dazzled Europe. And still, he married. 6 wives. 2 executed. 2 discarded. 1 dead. And 1 remaining, silently tending to the man who had destroyed them all. What did they see in him? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps just survival. Or perhaps, in those final days, there was something pitiable in Henry, something almost childlike. A dying beast who, beneath the fat and rage and rot, simply feared being forgotten. He commissioned new paintings, ordered final edits to his will, planned a tomb of unmatched grandeur, with golden angels and marble lions. A legacy set in stone. But Catherine Parr, ever the pragmatist, prepared for more practical things. She smuggled Protestant texts into court. She corresponded with reformers abroad. She readied herself for the king's death, because she knew. It was close. His skin was yellowing. His eyes faded. His speech slurred. His legs swelled with fluid. The ulcers blackened. The smell grew unbearable. Even the perfumed cloths no longer helped. And yet, still, none dared speak the truth. The king is dying, because to say those words aloud was to join the queens beneath the stone. By the winter of 1546, death had already claimed most of Henry's soul. What remained was flesh, and even that was failing. His ulcers now gushed fluid with every movement. Gangrene had devoured both legs. He had to be turned in bed by multiple men, who gagged despite themselves. His stomach bloated unnaturally. His eyes dimmed. His memory stuttered. But still, he clung to life. Why? Because death would end the illusion. Because death would mean surrender. And kings, true kings, did not surrender. So the charade continued. The royal physicians lied in their reports. His Majesty is improving. Courtiers bowed deeper, smiled wider, ignored the stench seeping from his sheets. Ministers forged ahead with proclamations in the king's name. The many were drafted without his input. The palace halls were silent, sterile, suffocating with fear. Even whispers were dangerous. A single word, decline, worsening, terminal, could be construed as treason. Some who had dared to speak it were already missing. Henry's mind drifted in and out of lucidity. Sometimes he spoke clearly, quoting scripture or asking about Edward. Other times, he screamed at shadows, called for wives long buried, or demanded his armor, delusional with fever. On certain nights, they said, he spoke to Anne Boleyn, begged her forgiveness. And in the early hours, his groans echoed through the stone corridors. Not cries for help, but howls of rage. As if furious at his own body for betraying him. As if trying to intimidate death itself. He was not dying like a man. He was dying like a god who refused to fall. But the body would not obey. His urine turned black. His gums bled. His voice slurred. His fingers twitched uncontrollably. His heart weakened. His breath rattled in his throat like a loose chain. By mid-January 1547, Henry VIII was bedridden, unable to speak more than a few words. Still, no one told him he was dying. No priest had been summoned. No last rites. To admit it, to even suggest it, was to risk execution. And so, in a grand act of denial, England waited for a king who refused to die. Until the 27th of January. The physicians could no longer lie. The color had left him. His eyes were unfocused. His pulse was faint. At last, Catherine Parr, still by his side, convinced the court to summon Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer arrived in the early hours of January 28th. The king was unconscious. He could not speak. He could not move. He could not repent. So the archbishop leaned in, whispered, "Do you die in the faith of Christ?" Henry said nothing, but he squeezed the archbishop's hand. A single squeeze. The only movement he could offer. It was enough. That night, King Henry VIII, Lion of England, tyrant of the Reformation, the man who broke the church and shattered his kingdom, died. He was 55 years old. But death did not deliver dignity, because death came too late. Most kings are embalmed with reverence, anointed with holy oils, swaddled in silks, laid in golden coffins, guarded by priest and prayer. Henry VIII was not most kings. His body, by the time of death, was already rotting. The ulcerous legs, the bloated belly, the internal bleeding, the stench, the sheer size. His physicians panicked. They lacked both the time and the tools to preserve him properly. Embalming in the 16th century was crude at best, but Henry's body posed a unique challenge. They stuffed it with herbs, packed it with lime and cloth, poured pitch around the interior of the coffin, sealed the wooden box shut with wax and desperation. But it was not enough. Henry VIII began to decompose within hours. The funeral procession was delayed for days. Cold January air slowed the decay, but not by much. By the time the coffin reached Sion Abbey, a tragic miracle had occurred. The coffin leaked. At night, it groaned under the pressure of gases and swelling. Cracks formed. Dark liquid seeped onto the stone floor of the chapel. And then, stray dogs entered the chapel. They licked the dripping remains from the cracked coffin. The moment was witnessed, recorded. Whispers spread. To some, it was a grotesque accident. To others, it was divine retribution. The king who once declared himself God's chosen had died like a beast. And now beasts consumed him. Chroniclers described it with cold precision. No poetry, just horror. The dogs fed at night upon the fluid of his body, which had burst. The symbolism could not be clearer. Henry, who once feasted while the poor starved, now became a feast for strays. Henry, who executed wives for impurity, now lay exposed, leaking, alone. Henry, who claimed godhood, now returned to the earth in the most humiliating way possible. His funeral, finally held in February, was grand, but hollow. The streets were lined with mourners, many of whom dared not show joy too openly. Royal trumpets blared. Black horses pulled the bier. Noblemen walked in silence. But beneath the black cloth, everyone knew. The king had burst. The coffin had failed. The illusion was over. He was buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who gave him a son. No tomb was completed. Though he had once dreamed of a monumental resting place, complete with golden angels and eternal firelight, none of it was built. Instead, he was buried in a simple vault beneath the floor. No golden statue. No eternal flame. Just a slab of stone, unmarked for decades. Even his physical legacy, the boy King Edward VI, would not last. Edward died at 15. The Tudor dynasty, which Henry had fought so hard to secure, nearly collapsed. It would be his daughters, Mary, the one he had declared illegitimate, and Elizabeth, the daughter of a queen he beheaded, who would rule. And it was Elizabeth, the girl he never wanted, who became England's greatest monarch. The irony is brutal. He broke the church for a son, and it was a daughter who became the savior of the crown. He destroyed wives for purity, and died unshriven, untouched by clergy. He called himself a lion, and was eaten by dogs. What, in the end, does it mean to be king? Is it the power to conquer? To command armies? To rewrite the laws of heaven and earth? To take wives at will? Sever heads without guilt? Reshape the faith of millions? Or is it something more fragile, more desperate? Henry VIII believed he could carve his name into eternity. He destroyed monasteries to build palaces, burned libraries to raise tapestries, spilled blood for the sake of bloodlines. He fought popes and lovers alike in the name of one thing: legacy. But what legacy did he leave? 6 wives, 1 sickly son who died a boy, 2 daughters he once disowned, who would define the future he could not imagine. A nation divided, Protestant and Catholic, noble and poor, terrified and loyal. He left no empire, no peace, nowhere strong enough to last. He left only himself as a warning. His portraits hang in museums, wide-legged, broad-chested, eyes fierce with command. But those paintings are lies. They do not smell. They do not bleed. They do not rot. They do not show what power becomes when it fears its own end. Because Henry VIII, in truth, died long before his heart stopped beating. He died every time he silenced a critic, every time he ordered a woman to the block, every time he crushed his leg into the earth, feeling the ulcer split open beneath his robes, every time he looked into the mirror and saw a monster looking back. He believed he was building something eternal. But eternity is honest, and history does not lie forever. We remember Henry not as a glorious king, but as a man decaying in silk, lashing out at shadows, bleeding onto marble floors, screaming at ghosts no one else could see. And we remember his death not with trumpets, but with dogs. What greater metaphor could there be? The man who once fed on power, fed armies, fed his appetites was now food, consumed by worms, leaking through his coffin, devoured by beasts. There was no final sermon, no last moment of clarity, no redemption, just a whisper, a squeeze of the hand, and silence. And then, rot, collapse, oblivion. The Tudors would die out within 2 generations. His son, gone at 15. His dynasty, remembered not for greatness, but for the wreckage left behind. And Henry himself? He is remembered best not for how he ruled, but for how he ended. Not in glory, not in peace, but in pain. And perhaps that's the truest lesson. Power is not protection. Legacy is not immortality. And kings, like all men, end in dust and dark and silence. Even the mightiest rot. Even gods can die screaming. If this journey through Henry's life and death taught you something profound, let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts on the greatest cautionary lesson from history, and don't forget to subscribe for more dark tales that unveil the truths behind the throne. And stay tuned for our next video, The 6 Wives of Henry VIII, Love, Betrayal, and Execution, where we'll uncover the lives, scandals, and ultimate fates of the women who shaped and were shaped by England's most infamous monarch.